Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, You Can't Handle the Truth! In this video we're going to be looking at deflationary theories of truth. So, the deflationary theory of truth is a theory that claims that truth is much more simple than we often take it to be, or much more simple than so-called inflationary theories of truth take it to be. All the theories of truth that we've looked at so far are called by the deflationist inflationary theories of truth. Other theories of truth have attempted to explain what we mean by truth, either correspondence to truth makers, coherence to other truth bearers, etc. The deflationary theory says that there's no deeper nature to truth beyond what can be understood from everyday claims. Basically, the deflationist says that all of this complex talk about truth is unnecessary. It's excessive. It's causing all the problems that you have with these theories. What you need to do is just talk about truth as a very simple concept. So, for the deflationist to say the balloon dog is red is true, or it is true that the balloon dog is red, is simply the same thing as just saying that the balloon dog is red. Adding the truth predicate doesn't really do anything to change the statement. There's nothing more to say about truth than that, other than that it is a way of kind of asserting a statement. There's not some deep meaning to discover in truth. Other theories have problems because they assume that truth is something more than what it is. For the deflationist, truth has no deep secret nature that's embedded in pragmatics or correspondence, coherence, or identity. It just is what you're saying. In this video, we're going to be discussing a wide variety of positions that have been called deflationary theories of truth. First, we're going to examine some of the diversity present in deflationary theories of truth, look at some objections to those theories, as well as some borderline cases of some interesting theories which may or may not be deflationary. In doing so, we're going to ask the question of whether truth is going to be a property for the deflationist. Finally, we're going to look at some objections to deflationary theories, and I'll leave it to you, the audience, to assess if those responses that can be offered are going to be sufficient. So, there are many names that have been given to deflationary theories of truth. I'm going to use deflationary theories right now to refer to basically all of them as kind of an overarching title, but you might not always see these theories written or known as deflationary theories. The problem with these names is they're not all applied to theories in a uniform way. We're going to give you some examples of some ways that they've often been applied to these theories, but it's common for these names to be used in different ways to apply to the theories. So, if someone disagrees with your explanation of a name, it may be because they've read in one philosopher's writing that name means one thing, while in another philosopher's writing it means something else. Some of these examples include the disquotational theory of truth, because it takes off quotation marks. The redundancy theory of truth, because truth is nothing but being redundant. The minimalist theory of truth. There's a lot of things that are called minimalist theories of truth out there. That's one to be very careful with. The disappearance theory of truth, and the no truth theory of truth. We'll take a look at some ways these names have been applied, but as I said, there's not a clear uniform way in which they're applied. Some consider that the originator of the theory of deflation was Frege, who, after posing the dilemma that led us to the identity theories of truth, looked for a solution in kind of a deflationary theory of truth. If you're curious about that dilemma, check out my video on identity theories of truth. According to Frege, when we say the balloon is shaped like a dog, we are saying something that has no more or less content than it is true that the balloon is shaped like a dog. Those two statements have no more or less content than each other. Predicating truth of a particular statement doesn't mean you're actually saying anything more or less of that statement. Other versions can be found in Tarski, Quine, Eyre, and Ramsey, though Tarski probably wouldn't be found under the category of deflationist. We're going to be doing a video on Tarski to better understand his theories, but it's from Tarski that often the kind of equivalent schema that forms deflationism is gleaned. They all follow something along the lines of the same general form. In single quotes, the balloon dog is red, end quotes, is true if and only if the balloon dog is red. It seems like a very simple statement, but we're going to do our best to unpack it. So, there are going to be some subtle differences between the ways that the various theories think about deflation. But before we can understand those, we need to look at a distinction from one of the first videos in the series on different kinds of truth bearers, namely sentences and propositions. If you want to go back to that video and check it out, you can, but we're going to talk a little bit about it here. So, sentences are grammatical structures that are made up of words and are language specific. Le chien est rouge and the dog is red are different sentences, even though they both mean the same thing, that the dog is red, because they're language specific. Propositions, on the other hand, are the meanings of sentences, and they're not language specific. There's a lot of debate on exactly what propositions and sentences are, mostly around what propositions are. I'm not going to go into that debate here. That's for another video. These are the basic definitions that most people go by. Le chien est noir and the dog is black express the same proposition, namely that the dog is black. But they do it in two different languages using two different sentences. The sentences express a proposition, but are different sentences. Okay? So some deflationists take sentences as their truth bearers, while others are going to take propositions as their truth bearers. The former we will see are called Sententialists, and the latter are going to be referred to as Propositionalists. So Sententialists say that any equivalent schema, any of the if and only if statements that we saw very briefly, but we're going to see plenty more of through the rest of this video, are going to be about sentences. The dog is red, in single quotes, is true if and only if the dog is red. Note when we're using those single quotes, we're talking about the sentence within those quotes, not the proposition. Propositionalist, on the other hand, says that any equivalent scheme is about propositions, and they're going to formulate it along the lines of the proposition that the dog is black is true if and only if the dog is black. So the equivalent schema for the sententialist is going to look something like the sentence X is true if and only if X. And for the propositionalist, it's going to look like the proposition Y is true if and only if Y. This is the first major distinction between different kinds of deflationists. And similar to many theories of truth, the way that we deal with truth bearers is an important piece of that. Check out one of the first videos in the series on different kinds of truth bearers and truth makers if you want more information on that. Now, to make this position clear, let's talk a little bit more about the sententialist. The sententialist holds that sentences are the bearers of truth. This means it is not the meanings of the sentences, the ideas or the things that they represent that are true, but the words and grammatical structures themselves. Propositionalists, on the other hand, take the primary bearers of truth to be propositions, or the meanings of sentences. For the propositionalists, the words are not what is true. The meaning of those words is. So, the other primary point of contention between different deflationists surrounds what is meant by if and only if, the kind of central operator to the equivalent schema. There are going to be three different positions that we're going to discuss here. I'm not saying these are exhaustive, but these are three general categories that people are going to fall into. They are the analytic interpretation, the material interpretation, and the necessary interpretation. Okay? We'll get into each of these one at a time. So, first, let's talk about the analytic interpretation. Remember that analytic statements are statements that are true by definition. This is a really basic concept in philosophy, the distinction between analytic, synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, necessary, and contingent statements are all big distinctions in philosophy. Analytic synthetic is one of those. There's a question risen by Quine that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this video that asks the question of, is that actually a distinction? We're not going to get into it too much here, though. Hopefully in the future I'll do a video on Quine's great paper, The Two Dogmas of Empiricism. If you're curious, just check out that paper. But for simplicity's sake, let's just define and make it clear what we mean by analytic and synthetic. So, analytic, a statement is true by definition. The predicate concept is just contained in the definition of the subject concept. If a statement is analytically true, that means it's true by definition. Examples might include bachelors are unmarried men, salmon are fish, and triangles have three sides. If you understand what a bachelor is, you understand that they're an unmarried man. If you understand what a salmon is, you understand that it's a fish. And if you understand what a triangle is, you understand that it must have three sides. Synthetic statements, on the other hand, are statements that are true by experience. The predicate concept is not contained in the subject. Everything with a heart has a kidney. It just happens to be the case. It doesn't necessarily need to be the case. All bachelors are unhappy, and it often rains in Vancouver. Examples of synthetic statements. With this distinction in mind, and not worrying too much about Quine and his dogmas, let's move forward to look at the analytic interpretation. So, therefore, under the analytic interpretation, the dog is red, the sentence, is true means the same thing as the dog is red for the sententialist. And for the propositionalist, the proposition that the dog is red is true means the same thing as the dog is red. Theories of this form are often known as redundancies, no-truth theories, or disappearance theories. Okay? Once again, with the names, those are roughly applied and not applied by all philosophers, so you may see those as titles, but it's better just to look into the specific position and see actually how they define their if and only if, their material biconditional. So, speaking of material biconditionals, or equivalent statements, let's talk about what if and only if means in a material sense. So when you see a triple bar in logic, that means if and only if. P, if and only if Q, or P is materially equivalent to Q. If it is raining, then I have my umbrella, and if I have my umbrella, then it is raining. It's a biconditional because it's two conditionals thrown in there. It's only true if the two statements have the same truth value. Equivalence is also known as a biconditional because it's the same as two conditionals. It's written as if and only if, or IFF. The reason we're talking about all of this is because it plays into the material interpretation of this statement. Let's look at the truth table just to be really clear. Truth table goes something like this. If both P and Q are true, the whole material equivalence is true. If P is true and Q is false, or P is false and Q is true, the equivalence is false. And if they're both false, then the equivalence as a whole is true. You'll note it's only true when they both have the same truth value. Okay? So, now to talk about the material interpretation. We call this material because it's interpreting statements as a material biconditional. Basically, they're saying that one side has the same truth value as the other. One part of our if and only if statement has the same truth value as the other, in the actual world at least. So the sententialist, if the dog is red is true, then the dog is red is true. And if the dog is red is true is false, then so is the dog is red. Basically, each half of our biconditional has to have the same truth value. If ever there exists some statement such that both halves have different truth values, the material interpretation falls apart. The same is going to apply for the propositionalist, but they're going to replace the single quotes with the proposition that. The term disquotational theory of truth is generally used to refer to sententialist deflationary theories of truth that follow kind of the material interpretation. But specifically, it can be used to refer to the material interpretation of the sententialist viewpoint. But it's not always used for that. So, once again, be careful with the labels, but disquotational theory of truth is often used to refer to the sententialist materialist interpretation. Okay? Finally, get to our final interpretation of if and only if, we should remember the difference between necessary and contingent. This is one of those big distinctions we were talking about. The only one we really don't hit here is a priori and a posteriori. So necessary and contingent. Necessary cannot be false. It's true in all possible worlds. Examples might include the sky is either blue or not blue. 2 + 2 = 4. And the ocean is not both blue and not blue. Contingent statements, on the other hand, can be false. There is some possible world in which they are false. George Washington was the first president. The number one fear in the U.S. is public speaking, and it often rains in Seattle. These are contingent statements because they are able to be false. They're not logical, necessary truths. So the necessary interpretation, then, these statements are interpreted as holding necessarily, or in other words, the biconditional is not merely true, but it's true in all possible worlds. This is therefore a stronger version of the material interpretation, which just takes it as true or false, having the same truth value, basically, in the actual world. The necessary interpretation takes it one step farther and says that they're true in all possible worlds. For example, for the propositionalist, the proposition that the dog is red is true has the same truth value as the dog is red in all possible worlds. And a similar rule is going to apply to the sententialist. Okay? The propositionalist version of the necessary theory that is defended by Paul Horowitz is known as a minimalist theory of truth. But once again, I think in our very next video, we're going to find another theory of truth that's called a minimalist theory of truth. So be careful exactly what you mean by that. It's better to just describe the position than to use the name and assume that everyone will interpret it in the same way. So, once again, we have the difference between sententialist positions and propositionalist positions. Positions that take their truth bearers as sentences, and positions that take their truth bearers as propositions. We also have differences between how you interpret if and only if, analytic, material, and necessary. This gives rise to 6 different positions. The analytic sententialist says the dog is red is true means the same thing as the dog is red. And the analytic propositionalist says the proposition that the dog is true means the same thing as the dog is red. The material sententialist says the dog is red is true in the actual world if and only if the dog is red. And the material propositionalist says the proposition that the dog is red is true in the actual world if and only if the dog is red. The necessary sententialist says in all worlds the dog is red is true if and only if the dog is red. And the necessary propositionalist says that in all worlds the proposition that the dog is red is true if and only if the dog is red. That's a lot of different positions. And they each have their ups and downs, their good sides and bad sides. Before we talk about some of the borderline cases of deflationary theories of truth and get to some more substantial objections to specific theories, I'm going to offer some general objections to a couple of these theories that we've offered and to all deflationary theories in general, based on the information we've provided. So, there's 2 ways I see we can object to kind of the analytic position. One is along the lines of Quine that I briefly mentioned earlier, who objected the analytic distinction as a whole, since the only way to define the distinction is actually going to be circular. And the second would relate to an objection to a particular theory of meaning that basically must be used to back up this schema. All that this schema really does is pass the buck of definition onto our philosophy of language theory of meaning. If you don't have a sufficient theory of meaning to back it up, your definition's going to fall apart. Perhaps not an objection on the whole if you can offer a sufficient theory of meaning. My worry, however, is that you can't, because I haven't seen good theory of meanings offered. So, a lot of the problems that come with the analytic distinction, as well as a lot of deflationary theories of truth, which kind of pass the problem on to our philosophy of language and our theory of meaning, is that they pass the buck, and until you can form a concrete and solid and complete theory of meaning, there's no reason for us to really put any credence in your theory of truth. For the necessary view, I'm also concerned, since if inflationary positions are not true in this world, even if that's the case, they don't seem to be logically impossible. Yet, if there is any possible world in which there's a reason that the dog is red is true beyond the dog being red, it seems that the necessary condition fails, or at the very least, it doesn't completely understand the way in which we're talking about truth. It oversimplifies truth. It seems to be an extremely strong claim to say that not only is deflationism true, but there is no possible world in which there's any more to say about truth than what deflationism says. And for the necessary position to be the case, any position that claims that there is a single statement which does not follow from the form X is true if and only if X must be logically impossible. Not just not the case here, but logically impossible. And even if all such views are in fact impossible, it seems that the position has failed to demonstrate or prove this point. This is something I'm going to come back to soon. The point is that even if deflationism is the case, I don't see a strong argument for it. There doesn't seem to be a good way to argue for deflationary theories of truth other than saying, well, a lot of other inflationist theories kind of failed, so we're just going to give up on truth and say that instead it's a moot point. It's a concept we can't really define that well. That seems problematic because it may be the case that truth is simply beyond our abilities or beyond what we can do as far as definitions. I'm concerned about it. Some general objections. Furthermore, for all theories, there's a question of how the equivalent schema could actually be shown to be true. No argument has been offered for the truth of the equivalent schema, and it does not seem that one can be, since the only thing that we can say about the truth of any statement, including that equivalent schema, is contained in the schema. How can we say that S, the equivalent schema, is true? Only by asking the question, is S the case? Well, I'm hesitant to believe any proposition that or any position that cannot have an argument to support it, because we're just going to end up in an infinite chain of reasoning. For all X, X is true if and only if X. Well, how do we know if that's true or not? Well, for all X, X is true if and only if X is true if and only if X, and so on and so forth. It's going to go on and on in an infinite stream of lengthening propositions that aren't going to provide any justification for our equivalent schema. Other than, well, it seems to me that that's what's going on, you can't really say anything strong and justified in favor of any of these deflationary theories of truth. And this isn't the end for the problems for the deflationists. Take this statement. T, this statement is true. It's not a contradiction. It's not something of a paradox. But according to the deflationists, this statement is true if and only if this statement. Not only is this bad grammar, it seems to simply be false. This statement is simply an object. It does not predicate anything of anything else. It's not predicating the existence of this statement, or this statement being in English, or this statement being true. The problem is, this statement by itself isn't saying this statement is true. This statement is just an object. Similar problems are going to apply to statements like J. Everything John says is true. This is going to be problematic, since everything John says doesn't predicate truth of anything. It's just a collection of statements. It's not saying that those statements are true. Those statements are 100 in number. Those statements are all in Chinese. There's nothing in the equivalent schema which says that these are true, simply that they are, which just makes no sense. We can't say anything important about T or J because there's nothing in the equivalent schema to interpret it when it boils down to just an object as opposed to an actual proposition or a statement. And yet clearly someone means something when they say everything that John says is true, or everything that the Pope says is true. It's an important statement and proposition that has meaning, but there doesn't seem to be any way to interpret it with meaning under the deflationary position. Okay. Those are just a few objections. We'll get back to objections a little bit later. But first, we're going to take a look at some kind of borderline cases of deflationism, especially when we're thinking about how does truth work as a property or not. Occasionally, when deflationary theories of truth are described, it's said that truth is not a property. Well, truth is a property under one definition of a property, but not really under another. So let's take a look at what exactly that's going to look like. So if by property we mean that two statements share some property P, then surely truth is a property, since all true statements or propositions share the property of being true. So if that's the definition we're using, then yes, truth is a property. However, occasionally this is not all that we mean by property. In some cases, we mean that there's a common explanation for a thing having that property. For example, when I say that two triangles are both equilateral, I don't just mean that they both share some property, but maybe they have different reasons for having that property. I mean that they share a property, and the reason for having that property, namely that they both have three equal sides. It would be strange to say that one triangle is equilateral because it has three equal sides, and another triangle is equilateral because it has three uneven sides. That doesn't seem to really be a property, equilateral, in the same way we want something to be a property. Equilateral, if it's allowed to be, well, this thing has three equal sides, this thing has three unequal sides, and that makes them both equilateral, right? That doesn't seem to be what we mean by having a property, especially of something like equilateral. But that's what we're forced to posit when we say truth. The deflationist can't say that two statements are true for the same set of reasons. So, while the deflationists can help themselves to kind of the simple or easier version of truth, or propertyhood for truth, they can't help themselves to the deeper meaning that talks about the reasons for something being true. Take the following two statements. H, the Hindenburg exploded, and J, Jules Verne wrote Around the World in 80 Days. They both have the property of being true, but have different reasons for being so, at least under the deflationary theory. So, while the correspondence theory, for example, could say that they have the same reason for being true, namely that they both correspond to some fact about reality, or the coherence theory could say that they both cohere to a set of propositions. The deflationary theory cannot help itself to these various responses. They can't say that there's one thing these two statements have in common that makes them both true. Since these truth bearers are simply equivalent to the claim that they are true, the only thing that makes H true is the Hindenburg exploding. The only explanation that we can offer would be things like it was full of hydrogen, which is surely very importantly different from the explanation for the truth of Jules Verne writing Around the World in 80 Days. He was not full of hydrogen, and even if he was, that would not mean that he would write a novel. The explanation for these two statements is different. The reason they're true can only be put down to just that statement. So, there's no common explanation for why these two statements are true. However, this doesn't mean the deflationist does not need to abandon truth as a property. Simply that they must assert that truth is a property like existence. The existence of the Hindenburg and the existence of Jules Verne surely have different explanations, but that doesn't mean that they don't share a property. Now, you might be not too comfortable with this because you might think that, well, there is a common thing that things that exist have, but according to the deflationary theory of truth, there's not something in common that all true things have. So it's a worry. It might be a problem if you don't accept this as an explanation of existence. Perhaps you don't think that existence is a property, or you don't think that really properties can be things that just share some property and don't share a common explanation. So, is truth a property? The deflationist is going to say yes, or try to say yes, and you might be able to pose an argument against that. However, there's some theories that are sometimes categorized as deflationary, which don't construe truth as a property at all, and don't even attempt to follow that line. Two notable examples are Expressivism and the Prosentential theory of truth. Let's take a look. So, Expressivism is isomorphic to the metaethical theory known as emotivism. Basically, any moral statements are simply someone's expressing their approval or disapproval of a particular act. The Holocaust is wrong is just tantamount to, I didn't like the Holocaust. For the expressivist, when someone says something is true, they're simply really willing to assert that statement. They're basically just yelling really loud that statement, or being emphatic about this statement. So if I say that it's true that the balloon is red, all that means is that I'm very willing to assert that the balloon is red. I'm not actually predicating anything of the statement. I'm just saying it loudly, strongly, and forcibly. I'm expressing it. I'm asserting it. The prosentential theory of truth, on the other hand, says that any truth bearer that contains the predicate is true simply is a kind of pronoun that references and can be replaced with the truth bearer that is claimed to be true. So just as H1, it exploded, is dependent on the reference of it. For example, HT, the Hindenburg exploded, is true, is dependent on the reference of that full statement, namely the Hindenburg exploded. In fact, HT just stands for H, the Hindenburg exploded, just as it stood for the Hindenburg in H1. All the prosentential theory of truth is saying is that all of our statements that predicate truth of something are just kind of pronouns that stand in for that statement without is true tacked onto the end. Now, one might distinguish between these two theories of truth and other deflationary theories of truth, since while these other deflationary theories of truth use truth as a property that's predicated of truth bearers, even if they don't claim that having that property implies a common explanation for having it, the expressivist and the prosentential theory of truth do not. The expressivist, the speaker, is not saying that the statement that they say is true has some property. They are claiming that it is something that they would willingly assert. The prosentential theory, on the other hand, simply treats truth predicates like a pronoun, like it, he, she, they, and so on. Since pronouns don't predicate anything of what they refer to, it does not predicate anything of the Hindenburg, neither can our truth predicates actually be predicates that predicate some property of the truth bearer. Okay, with those set aside, we're going to take a brief look into the deflationist theory of falsehood. Basically, as all theories of truth do, the deflationary theory of truth comes in a package deal with a theory of falsehood as well. For one of the propositional theories, it might look something like the proposition that T is false if and only if the proposition that F is not true. Note that such a definition does not allow for anything other than true and false propositions. This theory of falsehood commits us to the LEM for all propositions. Basically, anything that is not true is false. There's no in between. If something is not true, that makes it false. If something is true, then it's true. Now we're going to take a look at some more objections to deflationary theories of truth. There are many objections to all the different versions of deflationary theories of truth. We're not going to necessarily look at objections that apply to all of those theories, but we're going to look at some objections that are important to specific theories, as well as objections to the general deflationary theory of truth that may or may not apply to most theories. First off, let's take a look at an objection called the Truthbearer Dilemma. We have distinguished between two truth bearers that are used in different deflationary theories of truth, namely propositions and sentences. This objection claims that neither type of theory can account for what we mean by truth. In fact, it's going to take those two positions as the horns of the dilemma. According to the objection, propositionalism is going to be simply trivial, while sententialism is going to be just straight up false. Since a deflationary theory of truth must pick one or the other, the deflationist position is either going to be trivial or false. This objection was originally offered by Jackson, Oppie, and Smith. So, in terms of sententialism, we have to show that it's false. So let's take the truth bearer. The balloon is red. According to deflationism, the balloon is red, B, if and only if the balloon is red. But imagine that we take B as a sentence, and this as a necessary claim. That would mean it's surely false, since of course there are possible worlds in which English was never invented, or where those symbols refer to a different proposition. Clearly, necessary sententialism is obviously a false position, since those words in that grammatical structure might mean something else in a different world, and yet the end of the sentence is taken as a proposition, so it's taken as the meaning of those words in the actual world. So, at least in the necessary realm, sententialism must be false. And depending on your interpretations of the analytic statement, that one may be false as well. However, the propositionalist doesn't fare much better, since if we take the balloon is red to be talking about a proposition, the theory is going to be trivial, since it no longer is defining truth, but rather just defining what we mean by a proposition. And if it's taken, the deflationist cannot then offer a theory of meaning, since there's nothing to connect sentences and propositions. There's nothing left to define a proposition as other than the thing that is true. It seems to be something problematic, and it turns the theory into a trivial position. For more on this objection, because that may not have been clear, check out the SEP paper that I'm going to reference at the end of the video, or Jackson, Oppes, and Smith's original paper on the subject. There's also going to be an objection that is raised against the deflationists that comes from the kind of correspondence intuition. The correspondence theory of truth is very popular, and it's been offered by many theorists of truth over the ages. It seems that we have a very, very strong intuition that the reason that many statements are true is because of certain facts about the world. Yet the deflationary theory of truth claims that the only reason that a particular truth bearer is true is that it is true. And this claim is going to be shown to simply be false. For example, if you're a propositionalist and you support some kind of correspondence intuition, you might say that the proposition that the balloon is red is true because the balloon is red. Not if and only if, but because the balloon is red. Because we're looking for a theory of truth, according to the correspondence intuition, that gives us some explanation of why something is true. Basically, any given proposition is true because of something in the world, especially empirical propositions. The balloon is red not because of the meaning of the words, or just because the balloon is red is true, just because of restating the proposition, but because of some fact about the world, namely that there's a red balloon out there. However, this is going to give rise to some problems, as according to the deflationary theory of truth, since the proposition that the balloon is red is equivalent to just the balloon is red, according to the deflationary theory, they are equivalent. 1 and 2 are equivalent. So the proposition that the balloon is red is true because the balloon is red is equivalent to the balloon is red because the balloon is red. This seems to be really problematic because the reason that the balloon is red is not the same reason that the proposition that the balloon is red is true. When we're explaining the truth of a proposition, we're talking about referring that proposition to something in the world. But when we're talking about the truth of the thing in the world, or the fact that something is a certain color in the world, the reason for that is going to be something like someone painted it that way. The problem is that we don't think that 1 and 2 are equivalent. The explanation for the balloon being red might be because simply it was painted that way. It's surely different than the explanation for the reason that the proposition is true. It seems that the deflationist, with this intuition, is committed not only to the truth of 2, but to its equivalence to 1. So someone saying that the balloon is red because the balloon is red is the same thing as saying the proposition that the balloon is red is true because the balloon is red. The first one seems to express something interesting. The second one seems to be a false statement that doesn't even express anything interesting to us. A similar argument will apply for the Sententialist, but for the sake of time, we won't offer it here. There's also a problem, and this to me is one of the central problems with this theory of truth and many theories of truth, and that's the problem of truth-value gaps. So there's some statements that seem to fail at truth value. They may be neither true or false. The liar paradox and its relatives are common examples, and this is an argument that I push against most theories of truth and most theories, period. But others include things like moral statements, like one should call before coming over. Is that true or false? It doesn't seem to really fall in either category. And depending on your understandings of ethics, that might fall as true or false, but it seems for a lot of us intuitively, it isn't really true or false. Still, others include statements about non-existent objects, like the King of France is bald. Once again, that's going to depend on your theory of meaning and kind of your ontology, but it seems to many of us that the King of France is bald isn't really true or false because it's not talking about something. It's not talking about some King of France. One way or another, it seems that there are at least some statements that are neither true nor false. If nothing else, the liar paradox and its friends. The problem for the deflationary theory of truth is going to be that the deflationary theory of falsehood is simply a not true theory. The deflationist is committed to the LEM being true. Basically, anything that is not true must be false. There's no way for there to be any middle ground. However, that commits the deflationist to claiming that any proposition whose truth value cannot be determined is false. The deflationist is committed to the falsehood of L, but the truthhood of T. Statement L is false, statement L is false, yet this is clearly a contradiction, since we can replace L with T, supposedly salva veritate, but we can't contain truth, even though they are identical. We break either the law of identity, two identical things being equivalent, or we break the LEM. One way or another, we're going to break one of the basic laws of logic that the deflationist is committed to. Clearly, this is a contradiction. Some philosophers, in fact, have claimed that the liar paradox is a special problem for the deflationary theory of truth. Some have attempted to resolve other truth value gaps by appealing to a distinction between a weak notion of truth that can be applied to all truth bearers and a strong notion of truth which is only applied to certain truth bearers. This might resolve some of the problems with moral claims and claims about non-existent objects, but it's not going to help with the liar's paradox, because the deflationary theory of truth in particular struggles to help itself to that strong notion of truth which can only be applied to certain truth bearers that might allow for the liar paradox to be entered in as a truth bearer. Therefore, it's not going to be able to use the same strategy that other theories have used in an attempt at least to defeat the liar paradox. The deflationist is in a specifically difficult position when dealing with the liar's paradox, and I doubt that the deflationary theory of truth can ever overcome this problem. If you need one reason to reject that theory, I'd hang it on the liar's paradox. Another objection for the deflationary theory of truth is that they may devolve into a variety of primitivism. Primitivism is the position that truth is an unanalyzable property of some truth bearers. While deflationary theories of truth don't state their theories in the terms of primitivism, they seem to inevitably be identical in their consequences to the consequences of primitivism. So, for all purposes, all practical purposes, deflationary theories of truth are no more or no less than primitivist theories of truth. Deflationary theories of truth don't really define what truth is, neither do primitive theories of truth. They don't state that it's a primitive concept, but the theory has effectively the same consequences because they treat it like a primitive consequence. Neither theory really gives a metaphysical picture of what truth is. They just simply explain the way it interacts with other concepts logically. That's how you treat a primitive notion. This is concerning since primitivism is not only an inflationary theory of truth of sorts, but it's an unconvincing one. If you want more information on primitivism as a theory of truth, check out the video on the identity theory of truth for more information. Overall, the deflationists seem to be engaging in an entirely different project from most theories of truth. They seem to have given up on finding some common property that makes something true. The deflationist fails to answer the question of what truth is because they think there's nothing interesting to say about it. For anyone that thinks there is some common property that makes everything true, this is very counterintuitive. You may think that we haven't found that common property yet, but that until we've proven that there is no common property, there's no reason to give up on it. The deflationist hasn't really given us a reason to completely give up other than, well, we haven't done it yet, so there's no reason to think that we ever will. Simply, the deflationist is going to be someone that rejects the very intuitive notion that I won. There exists some property P such that any sentence is true in virtue of being P, and P is not transparently contained in the concept of truth. They're also going to reject I too for all true sentences X. X is necessary and sufficient for explaining their truth, or rather P is necessary. That property P is necessary and sufficient for explaining the truth of all true sentences X. If you're comfortable with rejecting these, and you can answer some of the objections, you might be able to hold the deflationary position. However, I'm skeptical, to say the least. The next position we're going to examine is known as pluralism. Pluralism is going to, along with inflationism, accept 1 and 2, but is going to disagree with the inflationist on 3. There's only one property P, and truth consists in all and only that one property. Similar to deflationism, pluralism is going to be kind of a theory that takes a step back from all the inflationist theories of truth. But contrary to deflationism, which says that all of those are wrong, pluralism is going to say that more than one of them is right. That was the deflationary theory of truth. Next up, as we said, is the pluralist theory of truth, followed by Tarski's truth theories, Kripke's truth theories, the revisionist theory of truth, and finally the two truths of Tibet. Check out the paper in the SEP on the deflationary theory of truth by Daniel Stojar and Nick Demjanovic. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.